you.
Charlie, let me begin with you as a professor of journalism and a former TV reporter. Define this true crime genre. For those who may not be true crime aficionados, exactly what are we talking about here?
Sure, it's basically looking at crimes that have happened, often cold cases, but not always, and what led to the conviction of person X, what the police did wrong, what the prosecutors did wrong. A lot of it is going back in time and kind of recreating what happened in the investigation, and it really varies, Mike, between legitimate true crime podcasts and sort of off the wall true crime podcasts. I think it has a lot to do with, are you practicing capital J journalism, or are you just wildly speculating about what you think happened and what needs to happen to the perpetrator, involving the family, to the police, to the prosecutor, et cetera, et cetera. So I really see it in two camps: legitimate and not as legitimate.
So there are many ways that content creators of this genre can approach this topic, but no matter how you do it, Americans, Marissa, seem to be fascinated with crime. It permeates almost everything on television: the nightly dramas, the police procedurals. Aside from periodicals and news magazines that ultimately morphed, aside from, what am I trying to say here? Aside from periodicals, one news magazine on television kind of morphed into a true crime series, and that's Dateline on NBC. And we are told by politicians, of course, around the country that crime is rampant, that violent crime is particularly rampant. That is not true. We know that to be a fact. It's not true. But the impression is that no one's safe anywhere. So with that impression, why are people drawn to these stories? Why do people want to read your book about serial killers who happen to be female?
I could tell you my take on it, in that I believe we possess something called morbid curiosity as fueled by protective vigilance. So what does that mean? So first of all, I'm a research psychologist, so I can't help talking like this. These are the words I use. But protective vigilance, I think we are tuned deep down in our psyche to pay attention to the things that could harm us. Now, I'm not saying people think Ted Bundy could jump through the television screen and hurt us. I'm saying we are pre-programmed to pay attention to those things to keep ourselves informed to a certain extent. And we might feel an adrenaline rush. We might find it exciting in some way just to pay attention to harmful things. You know, when there's an unfortunate car accident, something like that, we can't help but look. I think that this is the same type of phenomenon.
You may not know the answer to this, Marissa, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Is this a worldwide phenomenon, or is this particularly American, this interest in true crime?
I could tell you from my perspective. So I'm not a true crime author per se. I'm an academic, and I wrote an academic book, but I do get requests from all over the world: Netherlands, Germany, England, Wales, Scotland, Canada. People want to talk about this. Australia, New Zealand. So I don't know if it's a Western world type thing or a worldwide phenomenon, but I could tell you, I know that there's billions of people around the world that consume this type of media.
And it's certainly English speaking, because the PBS survives on these procedural detective stories out of the BBC. To get a full picture of any crime, you have to hear the victim's side of the story, and that, of course, is the job of reporters and the outlets that they work for, to gather that, whether it's reporting on a garden variety neighborhood crime, if there is such a thing, to the heinous acts of a serial killer. You just can't report the things that happen. You have to talk to the family, to the friends, to the neighbors, to acquaintances of the victims or the survivors. And Renee, up until you published your guide at the National Center for Victims of Crime, what were the standards for this kind of reporting?
Well, I think we had some excellent journalistic standards. I think the problem that we were looking at, and what led us to publish this piece, was that podcasters don't necessarily follow the same journalistic standards that we ask others to. And so for podcasters, and really for documentarians that we're seeing spin out and folks making TV shows, there were no standards. It was a little bit like the Wild Wild West.
Wow, and still is, I would think, to this day.
And still is.
A lot of times, the victims of crimes or their families will find themselves on camera doing interviews in the immediate aftermath of a tragedy. And one thing that your organization does, Renee, aside from helping journalists understand the ethics of this kind of reporting, is to help those being interviewed weigh the pros and cons, whether or not they should be interviewed. How do you do that? What do you tell them?
Well, we are actually releasing a companion guide to the Journalist Guide for victims to walk folks through those decisions in case we can't get to somebody. But some of the things we ask people to consider are you happy with the police action on the case? Are you happy with the prosecutor action? Because in some ways, that is where really engaging with the media can truly help. One of the things we also remind them to consider is that you can't control the public and you can't control what the public thinks about you. So if you choose to engage with the media, you have to be prepared for some really horrible comments. And my advice to every victim who chooses to engage is don't read the comment section, which is not very pragmatic. It's very impractical. But we want folks to be prepared for everybody feels like they can have an opinion, especially when they're sitting behind a keyboard and a computer screen.
As you pointed out, Charlie, a lot of these true crime podcasts at least deal with cold cases, which are cases that have maybe taken place a long time ago that remain unsolved, or perhaps there's some question about the decisions reached by prosecutors that may be wrong or right, or at least in the eye of the podcaster or the content creator. But as a former TV reporter, there's another kind of crime, and that's the one that's just happened. It's different when you're talking to a victim of crime 20 years after the fact. It's another thing to do it the night of. When crime occurs in an area, local TV reporters descend on the families of victims, and it strikes me as the worst assignment that you can get as a reporter, because you're invading the privacy of people who are in shock and who are grieving. Why the need, as a former TV reporter, why the need for those interviews at that time?
Well, of course, television is driven by ratings and by getting it first. We would hope that you want to be right in addition to being first. But Mike, one thing that I found throughout my career is that oftentimes the family members find it cathartic to talk about the person who just lost his or her life, even if it's a child. They find it cathartic depending on how you approach it. So we teach our students to be people first, be a human first, then be a reporter. And if you're a human first, you can empathize with, my gosh, this young mother just lost her husband, or whatever the case might be. So I think it's all in the approach. If you just rush in and start asking questions, well, you're not feeling that person's pain, and you have to feel that person's pain in order to give him or her a voice. And often they want a voice to talk about their loved one, but it all comes down to the approach.
We're talking about true crime today and the reporting on it, both in podcast and in real-world journalism, on Charlotte Talks on WFAE. But one of the comments I hear most often when people stick microphones in the face of grieving families, Charlie, is that, what do you expect them to say? It's not unlike these post-game interviews with athletes where if they drop the ball on the goal line and didn't score the touchdown, what do you expect them to say? I dropped the ball. What is the value for the viewer, for the listener, for the consumer of these interviews with victims and victims' families?
Sure. Well, again, I think it goes back to something that Marissa said, that we have this innate interest in things that can harm us, and if things harm other people, then those same things are possible harms to us. So we're drawn to that kind of story. But again, if you use the term "stick the mic in the face," if that's what you do, you're not practicing what I call capital J journalism. You're being more or less a voyeur. So you talk to the people ahead of time. I'm Joe Smith from XYZ TV. We're terribly sorry about your loss. Would you would you like to talk about person X and what kind of person he was and what he meant to the family? And again, it's just you have to know how to deal with people, not as story subjects, but as human beings.
I'm going to ask you, and then I'm going to ask Renee about this. Is this being practiced? Is this practice widespread in the real world of journalism, in newspapers and television and radio, etc.? Is that a widespread approach?
You mean to talk to the family members, or
and like
to
a human,
talk to them in the proper
approach
way?
them as well? To approach them properly. Is that a widespread practice?
Yeah, unfortunately, I can't put numbers on it, but often, I won't even say often, occasionally, someone takes the wrong approach, and that kind of taints the entire industry. Right?
But
so we as journalists need to be responsible, and we need to hold each other accountable. It's like, hey Joe, wow, that was kind of rough. I don't know if I would have taken that approach.
But then we have podcasters who are working for themselves. Many of them are completely untrained, Renee. What about those folks? Maybe they're working on cold cases, but maybe they're also working on contemporary cases. I have about 45 seconds. Are you finding that they understand that approach?
No, they absolutely do not. And I will also say that, back to Marissa's point again, the general public, even when done incredibly correctly, doesn't always understand that approach and doesn't always understand that these are individuals in the worst time in their lives. So we have people picking apart their psychology while they're on TV, saying, well, I wouldn't do that. Well, I wouldn't act like that. God, I wouldn't look like that. I wouldn't say that. And so it really takes a master interviewer to be able to help tell a story in the best possible way, knowing what they're facing with the public.
We're talking about the ethics of and interest in true crime reporting, and we'll get into some of the nitty-gritty of all of this as it has unfolded over the years when we come back. It's Charlotte Talks on WFAE.
We'll return to the conversation on Charlotte Talks after this break on 90.7 WFAE. I'm Della Friedman. On the next Charlotte Talks, the growth of community colleges in North Carolina and their impact on workforce development and more. Tomorrow morning at 9 on 90.7 WFAE.
Hi, I'm Mary Louise Kelly. At NPR and this station, we take our democratic role as watchdogs seriously. We hold the powerful to account, and we hold ourselves to a set of core principles: integrity, independence, accuracy, transparency, and respect for the public we serve. You play an important role in this mission as a donor to this station. Here's how to give, and thanks.
Help WFAE be there for you. Make a donation today at WFAE.org/donate.
Millions of Syrians fled their country during the civil war of the Bashar al-Assad regime. Many resettled in Germany, and now that Assad...
He's gone. You hear that?
Yeah, I heard that.
Yeah, he's gone. And now everybody's freaking out because...
Who's going to run Syria?
Yeah. They think they're really right-wing Islamists.
Mm-hmm.
That's the problem when you kill one of those dictators.
Yeah.
Who understands that you got to kick these people in the teeth.
Yeah. Like Saddam Hussein.
Yeah.
It's like, yeah, the only way to keep a bunch of savages in line is to be a bigger savage than they are.
That's true. That's what happened. Listen, speaking of that, when we get over here, what am I ordering for you?
A 12-pack nugget and waffle fries.
Would you be kind enough to loan me your card?
Yeah.
Because I can't reach mine from where I am for one.
Too intense, but you can use that media glare and kind of shift the spotlight, so to speak. So if you have police that aren't intensely looking at a case, use that. You can also use it to keep people's eyes for individuals individuals who are missing, because a lot of times our interest in these starts with missing persons cases. And so what is a better way than to find a missing person than to have everyone in the nation looking for them?
And despite the fact that sometimes as we watch these interviews on television, we think their reporters are being intrusive, as Charlie mentioned, some of these victims of crime and their families find the experience of talking about their loved ones who have experienced this, they find it cathartic. So Marissa, talk about that from a psychologist's point of view. Why is that cathartic? Is it any different really than talking to friends and family about what happened, as opposed to being on television or talking to a podcaster about it?
Well, I would think, like Charlie said, that it's just kind of a relief to get it off your chest. But I did want to address something, if it's okay, that Renee and Charlie were also talking about, in that I think people who write academically about crime and whatnot, like I do, have a responsibility in that, I'm not going to take part in podcasts or any kind of broadcast that uses exploitation. So if anybody asks me to give an interview, if you have gore in your background or you're drinking alcohol while you're talking about victims, that's not something I'm going to take part in. I think that really hurts people. And I'd like to share a story, if I may. I have a colleague who, her close family member was a murder victim, a high-profile murder. If I said it, you would know who it is. I'm not going to say it. She was asked to be on some podcasts. She was on a prominent podcast. She didn't know what she was getting herself into. And after the interview, they had edited in music and said, "Oh, what a sexy murder." And this colleague of mine was devastated. And so, like Renee and Charlie said, I think we have to try to be really sensitive. And I know the public's very interested, and I don't want to be hypocritical. I wrote a book. I want people to read it. But at the same time, these are real people with real lives. People have been the victims of the most horrendous things possible, and their families and friends and their colleagues are co-victims, and we have to be really, really careful and really sensitive to how we present and consume this information.
But that's one of the problems here, particularly for victims and their families who are being sought after for these stories, whether they're contemporary stories or they're cold cases that podcasters are dredging up. Unless it's a local newspaper or a local television or radio station that you hear.
12-pack, you said?
Yep.
And waffle fries.
Mm-hmm.
And barbecue sauce.
Mm-hmm. I did 1,000 screws today.
Wow. Joey, I'm always proud of you, son. The fact that you get up when you're tired and you go to work, that's good enough for me, Joey. That makes me proud. How are you?
Good, what can I get for you?
12-pack, Joe?
Yep.
12-pack nugget.
You want a meal or just a nugget?
And waffle fries, no drink.
Got stringy sausage?
Yeah, barbecue.
Okay, can I have your name?
Joey?
Okay, it'll be 10 and 10. You're all set. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Television, at least, do the people participating on the other side of that equation have a right to set parameters? And are news organizations bound to accept those parameters ethically if they do the interview?
Absolutely, you have a right. We can all verbalize the word no, right? We're all capable of saying no. And just as Renee was saying, I would not go on a podcast that I wasn't familiar with. Maybe I haven't ever heard of it, but I'm going to go listen to a couple of episodes, and I'm going to know this one's legit, this one's not. I would do something with Delia D'Ambra at Counterclock, but I'm not going to do something with Joe Smith that, XYZ podcast.
But I mean, that might work.
The approach he takes.
That might work if it's a cold case or it's a case that's been languishing for 3, 4, 5, 6 years. But in the moment.
Hey, Joe.
Yeah?
You know how much I love you.
I always liked that program.
Joey.
They always talk about...
Thank you. Yep, that's us. Thank you.
You know what I wish Mommy would have taken me to, and I told her I wanted to go, but...
Yeah.
There was this thing where they had a comedy show that all the jokes were about Charlotte.
And you go through them for everything.
And Marissa, these wouldn't be on television and radio and stories in the newspaper, etc., if there wasn't interest in this on the part of the consumer. And this gets back to this morbid curiosity. What is it that we are getting out of it?
It's true. If I may, I just wanted to circle back to what Renee said, in that in our worst times, we're not thinking cognitively. That's our brain's fear centers are the ones that are taking over. We might not know what we're saying, what our surroundings are, right? Your amygdala gets the first vote, your fear centers do. So it is a good idea to appoint a spokesperson. You had asked what morbid curiosity is, and it's interest in what is morbid, something that is horrible, horrific, gory, etc. We tend to gravitate toward those things. And I think most people have just about maybe most people have average, I guess that goes without saying, but I think most people have just this interest. Okay, wow, what was that? And some people don't want to hear it at all. I have a friend who doesn't even want to see my book, a good friend of mine. She's like, I don't want to see, I don't want to look at it. And then there's people way down at the other extreme that go to crime conventions and they want to own t-shirts and hair that belong to serial murderers and knives and stuff. And look, to each their own, but all I ask is that maybe we have some sensitivity to the people that these horrible things were done to. If I might ask, one of the worst things I've ever seen, they sell resin statues of quote-unquote famous serial killers holding knives, holding ropes, Ed Gein holding a shovel where he might have been digging up remains of what have you. And I want you to think about who's on the other end of that shovel. That's a person. That's somebody's mom or their brother or their child. And I really hope people can try to remember that.
When these victims of crime and their families, or the survivors of crime, do come forward, they have a lot of reasons for coming forward or allowing themselves to be interviewed, whether they're seeking it out or they're being sought out. But there's a recurring mantra that we've heard from the people, Renee, who have come to your organization, that they say about this, and it's, I never want anyone else to be hurt again the way I was hurt. Does participating in these activities with reporters and podcasters, does it give them some kind of closure?
I think to some extent, yes. I think that they think that they are also helping the investigation, getting information out. And I think that, as both Marissa and Charlie said, there are some cathartic moments in that.
Marissa, most of these crimes that we think about are committed by men. And yet you have written a book called Just as Deadly about women who are serial killers. And although there are no hard and tried and true facts about the numbers here, because it's still out there, it's kind of nebulous, you think, if I'm right about this, it's about 1 in 6 of these serial killers are women. Is that correct?
Absolutely. So that's what authorities think, about 1 out of 6. But of course, we don't know about the ones we didn't catch. So, right, that's just an estimate. Yes.
And there are crimes that happen every day all over the country, and we see them on the news. And then there are heinous crimes that are reported on by having stories that are played out over a series of episodes in podcasts or on television series. And they have become extremely popular. The New York Times reports, however, that women are twice as likely as men to listen to and consume these podcasts, and that younger women with less formal education are particularly likely to listen. Some have estimated, according to the Times, that the audience of true crime shows is 80% female. You kind of furrowed your brow there, Marissa. I'm not sure you agree with those statistics, but
I've never read that. I want to know what study that came from. I remember one study, academic study, that claimed that women consume more true crime than men do, but the study was based on counting the reviews of the podcasts. No, that's the number of people who reviewed them, not the number of people who listened. So I you know, as I'm a psychologist, I'm skeptical. I want to know where those numbers came from.
well, according to that article, some of the people who watch and consume these stories do it because they believe that by consuming them, watching them, listening, they'll come to and understand the psychology of the criminals, which will help them to avoid them. Do you think there's any truth either in the theory or in the actual practice of that being true?
Absolutely. That's just another way of saying protective vigilance, right? So if I pay attention to the things that can hurt me, I could avoid the things that might hurt me. Absolutely.
How do you do this as a reporter, Charlie, without sensationalizing things, without blowing them out of proportion?
Well, I think it's balance. You know, and again, I've mentioned sort of illegitimate podcasts that just it's just total speculation versus podcasts that, and I'm thinking specifically about true crime and cold cases that really delve into the facts and the evidence and the written reports and glaring errors that you would think anybody would notice. Why did they talk to this person and then completely switch, who said these things, and then completely switch to somebody else? How did that happen? So I think it's just a matter of balance. Present the facts without speculating on them, or if you do speculate, say that you are speculating, and then I can, as a listener, I can choose to listen to that speculation or ignore that speculation. But anybody can be a journalist these days. I just did air quotes, but not all are what I call capital J journalists.
Yeah.
And that involves really digging into the cold, boring facts sometimes, lengthy reports, poorly written, because police aren't trained to be journalists. They're not trained how to write necessarily in succinct ways. So digging into all that and really looking at why did they not talk to this person? Why did they not look at this document, which I was easily able to find?
We're talking about true crime today and the plethora of true crime stories out there in various forms of media on Charlotte Talks on WFAE. Renee, your organization, the National Center for Victims of Crime, was created, as I understand it, in the aftermath of the Klaus von Bülow murder of his socialite wife, Sonny. This is a story about his failed attempted murder of his wife, which left her in a temporary coma, and then his alleged insulin overdose that he gave her, which left her in a permanent vegetative state for the rest of her life. He was convicted, and then those convictions were overturned or reversed, and Town and Country magazine called him the original true crime star.
People didn't get to the biggest reason a lot of people listen to that.
Why?
Because some people like me like to figure out how the pieces of the puzzle came together.
Oh, okay.
Like,
I can understand it from you.
Huh?
I can understand that.
Yeah, like, how did they catch this guy? That stuff is cool to me.
You bringing your stuff in?
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't like the murder shit, and I like the investigation stuff.
Okay. Makes sense.
You know, I investigate when we go somewhere, don't I? Oh. I knew where the hood was in Vegas. Remember when we were driving up the road and you were like, oh my God, there's like 4 cops and we were north of the strip, and I said, that don't surprise me about this part of town. Hey, Mommy. What? Oh, it was awesome. Played dominoes and blackjack. Because I couldn't hear a thing in there.